Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, privilege, but most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Sandhya Jha is an anti-oppression consultant who particularly loves helping organizations get diversity, equity, inclusion teams off the ground. Sandhya is the founder and former executive director of the Oakland Peace Center, a collective of 40 organizations working to create equity, access, and dignity as the means of creating peace in Oakland and the Bay Area. An ordained pastor with a master's in public policy, Sandhya is comfortable in the pulpit, on the picket line, or hanging out with friends and friends-to-be over a good cup of tea and a good story. Sandhya is currently working on their 5th book for Chalice Press, and I have the pleasure to welcome her in this latest episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Welcome to another episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. And in my long list of wonderful guests that I've had, here is one more added to the list. So I have the pleasure to welcome Sandhya today. Welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks so much. Doing really well. It's a beautiful day in Oakland, California. I cannot complain.
Actually, I have to say in Cluj-Napoca, Romania, it has been a beautiful day as well. Hasn't really been like that in the last few days. So I'm glad we're having a beautiful day on both sides of the earth. Sorry, not the country.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna dive right in with my first question that I asked all my guests, because I think it is about, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, it is about connecting with people and first of all, I think being curious and getting to know them. So Sandhya, what's your story?
Yeah, so I love that we start with curiosity. I think it is such an important tool. So I think it's hard to know me without knowing my parents. My father was from West Bengal in India, right on the border of Bangladesh. And my mother is from Scotland, from a small mill town near Glasgow. And they met in Scotland. I was born in England. We moved to Akron, Ohio, which is the rubber capital of the world, where all the tires used to be made, when I was a toddler, and I grew up in Akron. Have lived other places in the US and ended up in Oakland, California, because I fell in love with a building that ended up shaping a large part of my career. I was raised in an interfaith household. I was raised in an interracial household. I was raised in an international household.
And this is very interesting. And I'm gonna have to ask at some point about that building, definitely, because that's now definitely the curiosity has peaked. But thank you for sharing your story. And indeed, it must be a very interesting experience. And yeah, I mean, I know a lot of Scottish people. I know I have a lot of Indian friends as well. And definitely these are different cultures. And even though I'm sure you can find similarities in all cultures as well, you must have had some interesting moments at home with these cultures that are, well, not very close to each other, let's be honest.
Right. I think the most interesting is how different the foods are. Although the last time I was in Scotland, I took my mother with me. I spent some time with my family in India, taking my father's ashes back to the Ganges, and then met up with my mother for a month in Scotland. And she had a little adventure on her own and took me back to the Indian restaurant she had gone to in Edinburgh because she loved it so much, because the Indian restaurant had haggis pakora on the menu. So it was this perfect fusion of her two favorite kinds of food, Scottish and Indian, right? So even though the foods are very different, they can sometimes blend with each other really well. I think what was interesting to me growing up is that my parents, across all of their differences, across all the barriers, across the fact that both families at some point disowned them and the reconciliation processes were slow, they did have shared values. And I think that across the very many differences, those two individuals held the same things in common, and that's what made it work. But yes, lots of hilarity ensued because we all had very different senses of humor, because humor is so cultural, right?
It is.
And so we learned to appreciate why each other found something funny, even if we didn't find it funny ourselves. And that was some of the best part of being in that household together.
And I can completely relate to that as well. I mean, I live now in a multicultural family as well. Again, with probably some differences that are not as big as some of the ones you've had. But I agree with you. Humor has always been an interesting thing at home and actually at work as well. I worked for a British company for a very long time. So always very interesting. Imagine the French and the Brits definitely have a long lasting war, and which is more of a cultural and more maybe more on the humorous side, or sports as well, quite often than it used to be. But definitely there is still that fight between the two nations about who is better.
Absolutely. One of an American humorist once said that Britain and France could never be reconciled despite France's repeated efforts to invade with sauces. So his argument was that it was the flavorless British food that was the real barrier between the two countries. I love British food, so
it's highly possible. I have to say, living in the UK, I did probably spend more time in Indian restaurants than I've spent in British restaurants, probably.
Yes.
Although there is some interesting stuff, but there is actually a beautiful book. I can't remember the name of the author now, but it's called 1,000 Years of Knowing the French. And I think that's a brilliant way to phrase it, because that's exactly that. It's like, it's almost, we're going to do it just to annoy you, and that's it. And we do it very well as well in return. So
absolutely.
So tell me a little bit more. I mean, I know we're still not talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging yet, although we touched up a little bit with the culture. But tell me about that building you fell in love.
So I moved to Northern California for a job with a regional church, kind of an organization that worked with churches all over Northern California. And I went to a building fix-up day at First Christian Church of Oakland, California. 40,000 square foot facility built in the Spanish colonial style, beautiful building built in 1929, and hadn't really been maintained since then. So the building was in serious decline, but the possibilities of it were so huge. And I learned more and more about the congregation, and it was because of what we call white flight. Back in the 1950s and 60s, white people were incentivized to leave urban centers and move to suburbs where they could buy property and they could have a different kind of life. And people of color had barriers put up so they couldn't move to those same places. They had to stay in the cities. They had to continue renting. So because of white flight, this congregation that used to be an upper middle class white church had become a working class, middle class Black congregation with about 20 members in a 40,000 square foot building. And they were doing their best to hold it together, and they were waiting for a moment where they could come back to life, right? So I ended up pastoring that church, partly because I had worked at the All People's Community Center in Los Angeles prior to that, and had had the experience of working with formerly incarcerated gang members and really a community center making a huge difference in an underinvested community. And so when I got to Oakland, I realized, oh, we could do something very similar here. And so long story short, the church decided to turn the building into the Oakland Peace Center. In the midst of serious violence, everybody in that congregation knew they wanted to contribute to peace, and they didn't have a lot of energy to create something from scratch, but they could volunteer with the organizations that were on the front lines of ending violence. And so we built relationships with a dozen nonprofits that were working to stem the tide of violence, to provide youth with opportunities, to address income disparities, and turned the building into a hub for all those organizations. So that's where the last 15 years of my life went. We're building up those relationships and then launching the Oakland Peace Center, where I was the executive director for almost a decade.
That is fascinating, and it's a beautiful story. And I'm sure you have dozens and dozens of stories to share around some of the things you've done there. But let's bring it back maybe like one layer up. In the work you're doing now, or you've been doing in the last 10, 15 years as well, and more, how did you end up actually doing the work that you're doing now around diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, and so now when I can get away with it, I describe myself as an anti-oppression consultant. Now, in most spaces, what I say is I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. But in the spaces I can get away with it, I say anti-oppression. And I had been doing trainings and workshops and facilitation around that with nonprofits and institutions of higher education and faith communities for about 15 years. And the summer of 2020, something that happened in the United States was a man named George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, a Black man, and it galvanized the country. Now, there had been a solid 7 years, 10 years really of intentional work being done by Black organizers and allies around police brutality, particularly against Black and brown people, people who are of Latino heritage. So it wasn't that it happened out of nowhere, but when this horrific thing happened, there was so much organizing support in place that a real movement shined forth. And one of my friends said to me, "You've been treating racial justice as your side gig for too long. This is where we need you to be putting your whole life." And so in cooperation with the staff at the Oakland Peace Center, I said, I think I need to transition into doing that full time. And we were able to make that transition so the Oakland Peace Center could be self-sustaining even without me. And that now all I do all the time is help organizations start teams to create a culture of racial justice and other kinds of justice within the workplace.
Amazing. And don't you love when you have a close friend giving you a little bit of a push,
Yeah.
to be polite, actually, because I wanted to say a little bit of a kick in the butt to say,
Yes.
come on, it's time to do it
Oh,
now.
she was much more blunt than I just made it sound. She's a union organizer from New York City. She said it in very blunt terms.
But it's sometimes it is needed a little bit, that push, because we don't always step out of our own shoes,
Yeah.
because while for some people it might be comfortable, for others it might be that we don't realize it. But these are the real friends that look from the outside and say, yeah, and I know what you need to do. You don't know it
Yeah,
yet, but I'm going to tell you. So
absolutely. And when she first said it, I dismissed her. But as I sat with it for a couple of weeks, I realized, oh, that really is actually the work I'm supposed to be doing. She's right.
mhm.
Yeah, so it was a real gift.
And thank you very much for doing all that work. And so you worked, and you mentioned it actually already, even from the moment you discovered that building in Oakland to the things you do it now. And I believe you wrote a book as well that has that name, about transforming communities.
Yes.
So what is it that you're doing on the ground when we talk about transforming communities?
So this is the thing that I get so excited about. It's part of why I love doing DEI work. Is at its best, diversity, equity, and inclusion and community organizing are about the same thing, which is helping regular people recognize how powerful they are when they come together to make change, right? And so part of the reason I wrote Transforming Communities is so many folks talk to me and say, I know the world is not as good as it could be. I know things are bad right now, but I don't know what I can do to make a difference. And so Transforming Communities, the reason I wrote it was to tell the stories of regular people who had gotten together and made huge changes in their communities usually that everybody else had given up on.
Mhm.
And I wanted that book to be a reminder to everyone I encounter that when you gather with other people with a shared vision, you can make such a difference in the world. And I think that comes from my decades of experience with community organizing work. It turns out we're always waiting for that big hero, but the big hero turns out to be 10 people, 15 people getting together and bringing that power together. It's never, at its best, it's never one person. At its best, to be sustainable, it's about all of us coming together.
And so going back to you gave the example of that person coming to you. So that could be me, really, coming to you and saying, well, I really want to do something, but I don't know what to do. What do you usually tell them?
You know, I often actually tell the story of First Christian Church of Oakland. We had that group of people who had been holding on to that building and trying to keep it together. And they didn't know what to do. And so we had a conversation and said, well, what's the issue that is deepest on your heart? And for them, and we also talked about what they needed, why they came to that building. And the reason they came is they wanted peace. And what they wanted to offer the community was peace, especially because violence is so horrific. And so many of us have survived violence and know the impact of it. But we didn't say, okay, so let's start a brand new thing, because we didn't have the energy for that. And so we said, well, who in the community also cares about that? Is there a way we can help them do that? And it was a case of taking the time to show up and say to people, what do you need? How can I help? And then have conversations about what more we wish we could do, and building up that community of people who were invested in a shared vision. So I think the first place to start is ask, what is it I care about? And the second thing is, who else cares about that? Can we have a conversation? Can we figure out who else is doing stuff around that and partner with them and build power from there?
And I love that advice here you're giving, because it's simple. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily easy. I was going to say it's easy, but no, it's not necessarily easy because you need to do that first step and have that reflection.
Yeah.
But it's a simple step to take for a lot of people who, because I think when the problem sometimes when, and I've had a discussion with other people as well, saying who want to do something, is that they imagine that the doing something means I need to organize a
Yes.
demonstration and go in the
Yes.
street and gather thousands of people. No, you don't. You
Nope.
need to start little and simple with yourself.
Yes.
And that's what is going to create that snowball effect. And as we've seen it with your story here about starting with a small group of 20 people and becoming such a huge organization. But
Yeah.
it does need to start with yourself. It does need to start little. And we forget that, I think, sometimes.
And I think we sometimes also think we have to do all of the things. I care about racial justice. I care about the environment. I care about economic justice. I care about LGBT rights. And when I think about all of those injustices, it can make me feel like I can't make any difference at all. But honestly, pick one thing, and then build relationship with other people who care about the same thing. And that's going to be a huge difference. And it turns out, if you pick one and do it well, you will end up doing all the other things as well. Because if you say, all right, I'm going to throw myself into the condition of workers, you will eventually deal with the fact that some of them experience discrimination because of their orientation. You'll eventually come across the fact that some of them deal with really lousy environmental conditions. You'll deal with the fact that some of them have limited housing options. You don't have to take on all the issues, because if you take on one well, it connects to all the other issues. And so your contribution to that one thing will ripple out across all of those movements.
Yeah, that ripple effect is very interesting to think about indeed, because again, yeah, it is not about doing everything. It's about doing one thing and doing it well, and yeah, the rest will follow.
And
And
you'll
so
get to
you,
connect with other people doing other things well. Let them do what they do well, and just make sure that you're connecting with each other. Yeah.
Very true. And so one of the things that, talking about communities, one of the things I'm curious about, and we briefly touched upon it in previous conversation, but that's gentrification. And I managed to say the word. I always struggle to say it. But this is something, first of all, that is quite new for me. So let's start with the basics. What does gentrification mean, really?
It's a great question. And, it's not an issue that faces every community, but what every community does face is some people get invested in and some people don't. So I live in a city that right now has some of the most expensive rents in the world. And 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what it was most famous for was being one of the most violent cities in the country in terms of gun violence. And what's interesting is 10 years ago, when people were saying that, they would say, oh, Black people don't have any self-respect, and they just decimate these communities and they don't know how to take care of them. And that made it easier 5 years ago for people with lots of wealth to come into those communities and take them over and fancy them up and make them so expensive that people who had lived there for generations got pushed out. And for most people who did that, the only part of the narrative they had is, I moved into a neighborhood that was dangerous and dirty, and I made it better, and now it's more valuable as a result. The part of the story that most of them didn't have was the decades of underinvestment, the decades of policies where federal highways got put through certain neighborhoods and tore them apart, the decades of state and city policies that shifted funding out of certain neighborhoods and moved them to others, policies that provided loans for white people to move out of cities and to buy homes that generated generational wealth, while other people, particularly Black and in Oakland, Asian and Latino folks, were forced to stay here because we weren't allowed to move to those suburbs. There were actual deed restrictions that meant only white people could live in those neighborhoods. And so we ended up paying more in rent than people were paying in the suburbs for mortgages, which means we couldn't generate additional wealth. And so there were literally decades of formal policies that went into making some of the neighborhoods here less and less vital. The schools had less funding because our schools are funded by property owner taxes. So if a neighborhood is all renters, that school doesn't have enough money to run properly. So all of this happens, and then Oakland becomes a fun, exciting place to live. All of the folks with resources move in and push out the people who have lived here in declining conditions for generations. Now, the thing about that is distinct in our area is suddenly this became a desirable place to live. But the thing that's true, I think, everywhere in the world is some communities get invested in and some communities get disinvested in. So gentrification is connected to that larger issue of economic injustice. And it's a specific manifestation. And the thing that is true about it everywhere is some people get to choose where they live, and some people have that imposed on them.
And so when we think about being allies and advocates around some of these issues, what is it we can do really? So what I'm thinking is, when I hear what you're talking about, is almost like, well, it has happened, so it's a little bit too late, but is there something we can actually do still?
Absolutely. And some countries and some states and some cities do this really well already. There are some cities that have a limitation of how much money people are allowed to make off of property ownership. You can see me cringing as I say that, because it's such an anti-capitalist idea that in the United States, even suggesting it would get me on some sort of list somewhere. But it's a common practice in a number of places in Europe to preserve the quality of life for renters, managing how much money property owners are allowed to make off of renting property, and investing in resources in those communities so that no matter where you live, you have access to healthcare, you have access to good education. And I know those are policies, and it feels like as an individual, I can't change policies, but actually policies are written by legislators who are accountable to voters. And when we organize and show up and make our voices heard, we can change those things. So I've been involved in a lot of campaigns here in Oakland that, for example, when somebody builds a very expensive luxury condo, they have to put a certain amount of money into a fund so that we can also build a certain amount of housing that's affordable for low-income people. So that's one small policy strategy. The phrase that some of my colleagues use is development without displacement. And the reason I love that phrase is it reminds me to be more creative in how I think. In this community, people tend to think either you're poor and you live in crummy, dangerous conditions, or we make a community nice and poor people can't live there anymore. But this idea of development without displacement is a reminder that we can invest in people of all economic conditions being able to thrive. And that actually makes for a better economic situation. It makes for a better city. It makes for people being able to be better citizens. that investment in people, and not just in rich people, actually makes for a better life for everybody. I like that idea of development without displacement, that we can improve things without pushing people out once they're nice.
And I think going back to the basic principles of diversity and inclusion, then that means as well, if these communities are more diverse, they're going to be able to thrive better, because
Yes.
I imagine it starts from the school, where all these children will learn from each other and grow with each other and develop. And then we're starting slowly to build a community and people, well, future adults that have learned how to live within a world of inclusion and belonging.
And how to recognize that that diversity enriches their lives, and they actually want that in their life. Yes, I totally agree with that. And I've got to say, I imagine this is true for you too. My life is so much richer because I know people from all over the world, and because I know people from different economic backgrounds. They have different experiences, they have different wisdom, they have different skills that are really helpful. So knowing people across class as well as across culture has made my life much richer.
Definitely. And actually it's interesting, as we're talking about it, I have that image of my school when I was from primary all the way to high school, which I haven't even thought about it for a long time, because it was a long time ago now. But it was exactly that. It was a variety of cultures, a variety of wealth, gender, obviously. And yeah, I don't think I realized it at the time, how important it was. But now that I think about it and I look back, definitely there is something that made me who I am now, in terms of respect I have for others and more understanding, probably. And I still have a long way to go, of course, but I think it made a difference.
Well, and the conversations we have with each other when we're young stick with us, right? So having that diversity at a young age, before we've learned what the rules are about what we're allowed to talk about, I think that diversity at a young age matters. So I mentioned my father's Hindu, my mother's Scottish Presbyterian. So I had already grown up with, religious diversity. But I remember when I was in high school, I had a very good friend, and she was Muslim, and a Christian religious holiday was happening, and she asked me about it. It's called Holy Week. It's the week when Christians remember Jesus' last week on earth, and him dying, and then being resurrected on Easter Sunday. And so my Muslim friend said, so that's what you all think happened to Jesus. That's fascinating. And I was like, what do you mean? It is what happened to Jesus. And she said, no, I mean, that we believe that Jesus was a prophet too. And I was like, yeah. And she said, but our understanding is that that Judas took his place on the cross, and Jesus survived. And he went forth and created this powerful movement that led to Islam. And he's going to come back on a big horse and rescue the world. And she's telling me this story, and I'm like, wow, that's ridiculous. And then I thought, oh, wait, my version of the story sounds just as ridiculous to her. And we both, and so it was this beautiful moment, because we didn't know what you're not supposed to talk about. So we're just telling the parts of our stories that we think are great. And she absolutely thought my version of the Jesus story was really depressing and not helpful at all. And I heard a very different version of the story from her. And it was so helpful, because not only did I learn about her tradition, but I learned how somebody else had experienced mine. And so up until that point, the only conversations I had had about Jesus were with other Christians or with Hindus who were just curious, right? And didn't have an investment in the story one way or the other. And so it was so good to have that moment where we could say, oh, there's a very different way of seeing the exact same story. And I've spent much of my life doing interfaith work, and it was informed by that kind of conversation. which would never have happened if my world had just been, or even just Christian and Hindu.
That is a fascinating story, actually, and I've learned something today as well. Second thing I'm learning today, so it's very interesting indeed how we don't always realize how the other side of the picture is not at all what we were expecting, and people have a way to think about things that is completely different, and actually there is no right or wrong, as you said. It's like that realization you're mentioning about, well, my story is as ridiculous as the other story, but or as brilliant, whichever way we look at it. At
this point, I would say they're both beautiful stories. Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing around interfaith as well, because I think that's an interesting part of your story.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been really fun. So one of the earliest jobs I had in organizing work, not in my early 20s, I worked for an organization called the Interfaith Alliance. I had a real passion for that because in the late 90s in the United States, there was a very strong movement to treat the United States as if it were a Christian nation, and as if to be Christian was to be of one political persuasion. And because my father was Hindu, I was really concerned about this. Part of the narrative I love about the United States is that it's a secular government, like India, where my father was from, like France. Although sometimes we joke that in the United States, we mean freedom of religion and France means freedom from religion. Whether that's really true or not, I think is very debatable, but it's the joke we tell. And so it felt like that commitment to religious diversity as a value of this nation was under threat. So I ended up going to work for an organization called the Interfaith Alliance, who was committed to preserving the rights of religious minorities. And that's a political campaign. We were working with state legislatures, we were working on federal legislation, we were lobbying, but you can't do that work without building out a multi-faith board and leadership groups all over the country. And so it meant that we ended up having conversations about policies that we cared about, but we also ended up having conversations about our faith traditions. And so I was shaped by Sikh leaders and Buddhist leaders and Jewish leaders and Protestant and Catholic leaders who had to figure out what things they did have shared values around, what things they differed on that they needed to name so that they could stay in that community with each other, and where there might be lines about what was not acceptable in order to create community. And we had some debates about, I remember one of the religious leaders saying, yeah, but we wouldn't take atheists. And one of the Buddhist leaders, because he said, we're interfaith, but they're anti-faith. And one of the Buddhist leaders said, yeah, but you know that many people would classify Buddhists as atheist. And the Christian leader was like, I don't think you're an atheist. And he said, yeah, but I don't believe in God. Buddhists, not all, but most Buddhists don't believe that there's, one divine presence. We're certainly not monotheists, but we're also not pantheists. We believe in the divine within ourselves. And by many definitions, that's atheism. And so we ended up having this conversation across the life of this organization where we all thought we knew what we meant by interfaith. Yeah. And we ended up doing a lot of learning together, which was important. So I do a lot of organizing around different justice issues, and we do religious rituals, but we do religious rituals where the rabbi might bring her particular tradition's wisdom around how we honor housing justice as a Jewish value, and then a Christian might do something different, and a Buddhist might, and we do multi-faith spiritual actions connected with the justice issues we're trying to address. And it's really exciting work, and it's really inspiring, because the thing that we all have in common is we're working towards these shared values, and we're also seeking encouragement from something that's bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. And it sounds fascinating indeed, some of the work you're doing around that. And I was thinking, as you were saying, you were talking about it, being a theist myself. Oh, I would have not been invited, but actually I would have loved to be invited there.
Right.
And be
And
part
that
of
was
this
one of the great
conversation, because
learnings.
it is.
Yeah, as I think there's a role for that. And that was one of the things we learned. In the 90s, we didn't realize how big our spiritual community could be. And we kept learning that.
And so what were some of the challenges that you had as part of that work as well, and where people, I think I'm more interested to, if you have stories about things that people may have learned where they were maybe not that inclusive, or maybe not that open to create that space of belonging, and then realize, actually, this is the kind of work I need to do on myself to be able to be more inclusive, to create that sense of belonging.
Well, and I think this one of the really important parts, and this is something that has carried over, one of the lessons from my interfaith work that carries into the way I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work today, is we can't do any of this work unless we're paying attention to power. And one of the things about power is when you have it, you don't always notice it. So in the United States, we talk a lot about being a secular country and being proud of the fact that we support freedom of religion. And the Christian majority really does carry a lot of power without realizing it. And so I remember one of my favorite board members, anytime, so we would try to close with prayer, and you know, when a Sikh leader or a Buddhist leader or a Muslim leader led the prayer, they would say, in my tradition, we do such and such, but they would do their best to also lead a prayer in a way that even if you weren't from their religious tradition, you could participate in it. But there was one board member who every single time he would say, and in the powerful name of Jesus, we pray. And there was one rabbi who finally called my boss and said, if he does it one more time, I'm going to have to quit. I love him, but it's just hurtful every single time. And so my boss had to, I think I didn't have to make that call. I think my boss made the call and had to say, we all know that you don't mean any malice when you do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be on this board. But you got to understand the history of how that phrase has been used to cause harm to the people that this other board member serves, right? And he couldn't hear it, this board member. And he was like, listen, I'm an African American. My people were enslaved. You don't get to tell me that I am causing someone else harm when this is the religion that my people used to liberate themselves from slavery. And so there was a lot of tension that showed up in that, because somebody had experienced such horrific racial violence his whole life and for generations before, he couldn't see that in this one other way, he had power. Because he's looking at the other person and being like, yeah, but you have all this white privilege and you have all these resources and your synagogue is rich. How are you telling me that I have power and I'm hurting you? And so navigating the complexity of where we have power and where we experience oppression is a complicated part of this work. But when we can get to that place of being vulnerable enough to say, oh, I have experienced oppression, and even so, I was not aware of this way in which I was misusing my power, or how my unconsciousness about my power was causing harm to someone else. That's some of the most interesting work, and some of the most complex.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting, because there's that. I think it's an unconscious bias here about that power, and I think that that reflection on, do I have power, first of all, and then am I using it in a way that may harm other people,
Yeah, and I think a
is a
lot of
very
people,
interesting reflection.
yeah, you're just. I think a lot of people stop at I don't have power. That
Mm,
to absolve ourselves, we say, well, I don't have any power, and by not being honest about where we have it, we're then not able to be in relationship.
very true. That, very interesting point. I love that, and I don't think I've ever asked myself that question, for some of you obvious reasons, because I think I am definitely in a place of privilege, from my sexual orientation to the color of my skin to probably as well the way I've been raised, and the social economic background I have, and male, being a male as well, and so on. But it's very easy to not ask yourself that question. I've asked myself many questions when it comes to diversity and inclusion, but that specific element around power, I don't think I've ever really asked about it in that really that term. So I think that's something that's definitely going to go on my notebook as a, yeah, let's think about it once in a while, depending on the groups. And as you said, it depends on the group we're in,
It does.
on the situation, on the context where we are at that point in time. There are probably people on this planet that have power in most situations, but as well, we should not forget that there are specific instances where we think we may not have any power, but we do actually.
Right. And power's not automatically a bad thing. We can choose how we use it. So if we admit that we have power, then we can think, so how do I use that power in ways that are constructive? Yeah.
Yeah. And definitely something on that note, how do I use it for all the white straight male out there, including myself? If we have most of the time that power, how do we use it? And I think
Yeah.
that's the whole point of this podcast as well, to think about, okay, how can we use it for doing something better beyond ourselves and for the people around us?
And to connect that back to the very first thing you said at the beginning of our conversation today, which was, how do I listen? How do I be curious? Because when we do, when we have a certain level of power and we listen and are curious and connect with people with different experiences, well, they might see things that we don't, and we might be able to help them address those things in ways that they wouldn't be able to. So some partnership can show up in the process.
Completely. And so I'm conscious that we're coming to an end to our conversation, so I'm going to move into that place of curiosity, and I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, what is one thing you would want to leave us with?
That's a great question. I think sometimes the biggest barrier we experience in our work around diversity, equity, and inclusion is the terror of getting something wrong. And I think that it comes from a really good place. We don't want to cause harm. I think that is so beautiful. The interesting thing is, when we don't do anything, we also cause harm because we allow things to stay the way they are. And so I'd love to invite people to think, where am I going to risk being wrong for the sake of deeper relationship, deeper understanding, and the possibility of growing and growing in community? So the very simple act of thinking, oh, I'm never going to get nothing wrong. So how about I risk getting something wrong for the right thing?
I love it. I love it. I think it's a great thing to leave us with, and it's very interesting because I had exactly that discussion with one of my daughters this week, on the more academic side. but on the idea that actually making mistakes is what is making us grow and move forward, and it's okay to make mistakes. So I'm very glad. I'm gonna make her listen to the podcast as well. Then she's probably gonna get bored after about 30 seconds. She's a bit too young for that, but maybe I'll put her the last few minutes so she can hear it from other people as well. That it's okay to go and make mistakes. But Sandhya, thank you so much for having spent the last almost hour with me. One last question I want to ask you is if anyone wants to reach out to you and learn more about you, or maybe work with you as well and continue that conversation, what's the best way for them to do that?
I would love that. In fact, if you go to my website, withoutfearconsulting.com, and sign up for my newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter. It's called Joy in Justice, because I want us to remember that this work can be joy-filled and exciting and inspiring. It's a great way to stay in touch and to reach out to me that way. I'd be thrilled.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put all of this information as well in the notes of the podcast. So if anyone wants to go on your website, but at least they know now where to find you and what's the best way to kind of keep in touch with you and some of the work you do. Once more, thank you so much for being here, being present, being yourself, and for all the work you're doing as well out there. I think it's wonderful, and I'm glad I had a chance to connect with you. So thank you so much.
Julian, thank you. It's been lovely.
It has been indeed. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.